This morning we'll start out with a question, and the question is, what are you angry about? And you could say nothing, and hopefully that's true, but you might be angry about something. Maybe actively, maybe something happened this morning, or maybe you're angry from something from last week, or maybe you've been angry with someone for a long time. And this morning, whatever it is that you're angry about, because everybody deals with anger at different points, we're going to try to address it and see not just how we would deal with anger, but instead how God deals with anger. And so we're going to take a look at this concept, and we're going to be looking in Genesis chapter 4 for an example of anger and of how God will respond. And so we'll be there if you want to go ahead and open up to Genesis chapter 4. But to start out with, let's just address the very basics here. First off, asking what is anger? And anger is just an emotional response that's quite simple, quite primitive almost, and it is not usually in our control. Let me be clear. The emotional response, anger, is usually not so much within our control, although it can be made worse if we give into it often. But that initial response is kind of the same as fear. You don't choose to be afraid when something loud goes off behind you. You just are. And so it is most of the time with anger, but then from there, of course, anger becomes a choice as to whether you hold on to it or whether you let that go. Each one of us, mainly based on how we were raised, that is, the examples that we watched growing up and the things that we've picked up from other people, each one of us has a preferred set of responses to anger. And it's almost embarrassing for us to think about, but what do you do when you get angry? Because you do something, and your spouse could probably tell you, maybe your parents could tell you, maybe your children could tell you, but you do something. And so it may be that you shut down altogether. It may be that you become silent. It may be that you get passive-aggressive or violent, or that you lash out at people whose fault it isn't really. But you have a set of responses to anger. And those things have been picked up over time. Those things have been learned, but those things can be changed. More importantly, we can look at a better way to handle things. It doesn't mean it's going to change or change immediately, but we can at least look to a better example. Now, anger is not necessarily bad, but we can go too far with this idea too. Usually if someone says that you can be angry, they'll also say that you can be angry and not sin, according to Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29. And so you say, okay, that's true. You can be angry and you can not sin. That's great. How often does that happen? Is that normally what takes place, that you get angry and then everything calms down and you're fine? Most of the time, anger does lead to something negative, even if it is not sin. But again, anger is not inherently wrong or inherently sinful. For example, God himself is often described as being angry or being jealous. And so there is a little bit of room there. But it all depends on what happens after this initial event that causes the anger. And so it could be that we internalize the anger, that it stays bottled up. It could be that we deny that the anger exists, which only makes things worse. It could be instead that we release the anger immediately and explosively. Or hopefully it gets processed and eventually benefits us in some way. But if anger is not inherently bad, it is inherently dangerous. It can always lead to things getting worse. It always has that potential. And so it will cause that harm unless it is dealt with in some way that's more positive. But in this story, in Genesis chapter 4, we see someone get angry. In fact, we see perhaps for the first time someone become angry. And so the characters that are in this story, there are three characters. One is Abel, although he will shortly not be in the story anymore. And then you have Cain. These are the third and fourth humans to ever live on the earth. The only examples they've had so far are their parents. Now, they've lived on earth for a while. All it says is in the process of time, which just means sometime after the events we talked about before. Evidently, they are old enough that they are responsible for some farming operations. One of them, specifically Abel, is a keeper of the flocks. So he's old enough that that's his responsibility. That means he's probably not 3 years old. We're probably talking about teenagers. We might be talking about young men here. And then we also have Cain. Cain is, at this point, tending to the crops. Okay, so they're old enough to do these things, and they're old enough to have learned possibly how to deal with anger from their own parents. And so God is going to not require an offering, it seems, or at least it doesn't say, but Cain and Abel, they are going to make an offering to God. And we discussed this fairly recently on our Wednesday night class, but we're coming back to it now to approach it from this angle of anger. In verse 5, going back to the text itself, it says, "But he," that is God, "did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell." Cain's offering is not respected. Why? Well, we offered some suggestions before when we looked at this, but all we know is that there's a hint in the text that Abel's offering was better, because of Abel's offering it says that it was of the fat of the animals that he had and of the first of the animals that he had. It doesn't describe Cain's offering that way. And so the best guess is to say, well, he didn't offer the best that he had. He didn't offer the first of what he had. He offered sort of the leftovers to God. Well, that wouldn't work, obviously. We wouldn't expect that to work today. It could be that there's some other element going on here as well. It could be that you could add pride into this equation, or it could be that he is a bit reluctant. He's not a cheerful giver, as the New Testament would call it. All those things are possible. We don't know for sure. What we do know is God didn't accept it. He didn't want it, and Cain was angry as a result. In fact, he responds in two ways. One, he is very angry, and the other is that it says his countenance fell, meaning that his face showed that he was angry. He was upset. He had a long face. So he gets upset, and then God's going to respond. Now, this is the part that we care about. It doesn't really matter that Cain gets angry, because we know what anger looks like. We've experienced it ourselves. We've watched it play out in other people. And so when someone gets angry, we get that. But how should somebody respond? Well, if anybody can respond appropriately to anger, you would think that it would be the God who created humanity and the rest of the universe. And so how does he respond to Cain? In verse 6, it says, "And so the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desires for you, but you should rule over it.'" Simple response, short response, but there's a lot of things we can take from it. So let's start with this. God responds in a confrontational way. Now, if you are dealing with someone who is angry, the last thing you usually want to do is confront them. And it's not clear how much time passes here. All it says is that this is what Cain did and this is what God said. It doesn't say that that happened the same second. It doesn't say that it happened 2 days after. We just aren't really told. But in this case, God is willing to confront Cain in his anger. But he does so not in an argumentative way. He doesn't bring this up in a way to make Cain feel bad about it, but it is constructive, as we'll see. And so he does a couple things. One, he responds calmly. The text has already said that Cain was very angry. He wasn't just a little bit angry, he was all the way. And so God responds, he doesn't appear angry at all. Now, we may just be reading the text that way, but all God says is, "Why are you angry?" Well, that may be an appropriate way to respond for us as well, in two senses here. One, to be calm, not just to say, "Hey, get over it," or say, "Hey, I'm God, and this isn't appropriate behavior. If you do that again, I'll strike you dead." That's an option, I suppose, but that's not how God responds. Instead, he says, "Why are you angry? What is it that you're angry about?" He gives them an opportunity to speak about the anger that he feels. He also asks an important question here, which is in verse 6, the way that it's phrased, "And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted?" Verse 7. He says, you haven't been accepted, but is the path that you're taking, is this path going to lead you to what you want? That's the best way I know how to phrase the beginning of verse 7 there. If you do the right thing, if you change your course, won't that result in the thing that you're desiring? Won't that get you acceptance with me? Isn't that the best solution? In Cain's mind, obviously, he wants to stay on the path of anger. God says, there's another option here. And the other option, it'll get you exactly what you want. But what will anger get you? Anger will get you nothing. In fact, God gives a warning. He says, if you continue on with this, then sin lies at the door, and its desires for you. The warning, the realism of this, and the reasoning that God uses is, Cain, if you will do better, things will get better. If you do worse, things will get worse. Those are your two options before you. And so God, what he does is he responds calmly, he responds with questions, and he responds with reason with the person that is angry in this situation. So God is giving Cain a little bit of perspective that he's missing here. Perspective of maybe what Cain has forgotten in his current state. I don't know how you respond whenever you're angry, but it seems for some reason that you can't really remember everything you're supposed to remember and be angry at the same time. For some reason, you forget everything that you used to know, and all you see is red, as the phrase is. And so, with anger, unfortunately, the way that God responds, and probably the best way to respond at some point in dealing with it, has to be with this real world, getting back to a grounded perspective of things. And so that's what God does. He brings him back down and says, hey, Cain, listen. If you continue on this way, things are only going to get worse. If you want to do better, great. Things will get better. If not, things will get worse. The problem with this, though, and I'm not saying that God has done something wrong here, obviously, but the problem is that anger hates rational thinking. You ever notice that in your own anger? Do you want to be told the truth when you're angry? Do you really want somebody to ask these questions to you? That's what God does, though. And at some point, those questions have to come up. It doesn't have to be immediate, maybe, but those questions have to be brought up to respond here. Anger also hates a calm response. In fact, God inspired these other words in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1, that a soft answer turns away wrath. Well, this is God acting out what he would speak later on in Proverbs. He's giving a soft answer, in theory turning away wrath, but there's still the choice available to Cain. There's always been that choice. And Cain says, I could do better, and I could let my wrath subside, but instead, I'm going to go talk to my brother real quick. I'll be right back. And we know how that ends. The other thing that God does is that he reminds Cain of one other thing that he probably doesn't want to know. He says, after mentioning that sin lies at the door and it desires you, he says, but you should rule over it. When you're angry, this is the simplest thing in the world, and you've probably heard this said by your own parents. But when you're angry, it's not an excuse for any other action that takes place. And so in this situation, God says you should rule over it, your emotions in particular. You should overcome them because otherwise they will overcome you. And you are still responsible for whatever you do in this state. It doesn't matter that you're angry. If you say this, if you do this, if you make an action that can never be remedied, as in if you kill someone, that's still on you. The responsibility is always on the person, no matter what the emotional state is. It may change the prison time a little bit, if it's premeditated or not, but it's still your responsibility, and spiritually is more important than legally. So what do we do with this scene here of God dealing with Cain, of responding to anger? How do we learn from it? What do we apply to ourselves? Well, the first thing is this. If you are dealing with someone who is angry, first off, sorry, because that's never easy to do. Second, the angry person might be yourself, so that's difficult also. But third thing, if you're dealing with someone who's angry, don't expect that you can always fix the problem. The reason we can say that with confidence is because the God who created humanity tried to intervene with Cain. Cain was very angry. God came to speak to him, and Cain still made a terrible decision. Just because we speak to somebody and try to help somebody who is angry, that doesn't mean that we're going to fix their problem. It's their problem, and if they want to fix it, they will. If they don't want to, it may not be fixed. But even God couldn't talk Cain out of this potential sin, and so we shouldn't expect that we will have total success every time. I don't say that to discourage, just to put some realism into this. That we shouldn't think that just because we're talking to somebody, trying to help them, that will automatically fix things. But the second part is what we kind of already said, but how do we respond to an angry person? Well, unfortunately, we have to respond in a calm way. In fact, the angrier someone is, the calmer we should respond. That's easy, isn't it? Not so much. But that is the ideal, and that is the response that God would make, but it's the response that we can only work toward. The second thing is, sometimes there is room to give space to someone who is angry. As we said, the text isn't very clear as far as the timeline. It just says this happened and this happened. And it doesn't tell us when. So God may have given a little space. He may not have. But what he does do is he gives an initial response. He gives Cain some things to think about, some things that if Cain is willing to make the choice, could help his situation, and then he leaves. Really, he only says about 2 sentences, God does, to Cain. And he says, okay, Cain, I'm gonna walk away now. You think about it. Cain didn't really think about it, and he went about his business and killed his brother. The third thing, as we said, is to ask questions. And so if someone is angry that we're talking to, then the questions do have to start at some point. Maybe not immediately, but especially the longer someone has been angry about something. If this is something that's been going on for months or even years, these questions have to come up. They have to be brought up. They have to be able to help process the anger that's there in the first place. And so it's questions like this. Do you know why you're angry? That's what God asked Cain in the first place. But do you know what it is that's made you angry? Are you angry in proportion to what has taken place? And so too often this is not the case, that a small incident has happened and all of a sudden somebody is all the way at a 10 on anger. It's not rational. There's not a real connection there, but something else might be going on. And so that would be maybe the third thing to bring up. Is there some other factor that's causing this burst of anger to be greater than it should be? What else is going on that's adding to this state? The fourth thing, like God points out, do you realize that even if you're angry, even if you have that emotion, that you are still completely responsible for every action that you take from here on? That every word that comes out of your mouth is still yours to deal with, even when you aren't angry anymore. Because you won't be angry forever, but the things that you say, the things that you do can last much longer than the anger does. And then like we said, we personally and we for others should examine what is our response to anger? What is it that we do when we get angry? And if you don't know what you do when you get angry, again, just ask someone else because they know perfectly well how you respond every time that it comes up. So all of those things are good to ask. When you ask those questions, just make sure that you're behind something very solid and that you can take cover because some of these responses will not be pleasant. And that's the harsh reality of anger. Anger, it's part of life, but Satan can use it very easily, and he does use it very often. And so when we try to deal with someone who's in this situation, it may not always immediately be for the best. But it may be that we have to let people simmer down a little bit over time. Alongside this, a question may come up, is it good when people are allowed to vent? And there's kind of 2 sides to this. When we say vent, we mean that they freely express whatever it is that they're thinking, usually with a little bit of anger added into that. And so there's 2 sides to this. On the one side, it's good for people to express their emotions. That's true. And it can be therapeutic, potentially. It can be beneficial for your understanding of what that person's going through. And so there can be good things. But on the other side, for one, in the book of Proverbs, chapter 29, verse 11, it says that a fool vents everything that he feels. Okay, well, that has to factor in somewhere into that question of is it wise to let someone vent? The other side of venting, though, the problem is too often venting just becomes either hateful toward one specific person, it becomes a self-feeding cycle where the person just starts to rant more than anything else. They start to just talk about the same thing over and over. It's at that point, it's not therapeutic to that person. It's not beneficial to anyone. It's just feeding into the anger that's already there. And so venting, it can be okay, but if it devolves into just a new cycle of anger, it's not benefiting anyone. So some care has to be taken there. Another thing we can say about anger is that anger can, in fact, cause improvement. Now, we said that anger is inherently dangerous. It's not inherently beneficial, but it can be beneficial. It can be used to help us to grow into something or someone better. In the case of Cain, God sets him up perfectly. All he says is, Cain, you're angry. You can tell me about why you're angry, but recognize that if you do better, things will improve for you. You can use your anger, you can turn that anger into a redoubled effort to please God. That's fully possible. It was within Cain's grasp, and he said, no, that's not the way that I'm going to go with this. I see sin crouching at the door. That's the direction I'm headed. And so Cain makes a poor decision, but ultimately his anger, his frustration with his brother and really with himself, if it had have been directed in a positive way, he could have made his next offering the best that it could have ever been. Instead, he chooses differently. One other thing that we'll say is this, that sin is in fact crouching at the door, to borrow the phrase from our text. And so the question becomes more personal. The question is, what are you still angry about? What are you still angry about? There's something. Again, it may have been something from this morning or yesterday. It may be something from 10 years ago that happened that you haven't got over. What are you still angry about? What are you holding on to? And then you go through those questions and you say, is what I'm angry about, is it proportional to the thing that actually happened? Or have I made it into something more? Am I angry at the right person? Or is the person myself, as it should have been in the case of Cain? And maybe the better question, and the same question for Cain, is this. Is the thing that I'm angry about, the thing that I'm holding on to, the thing that I'm bitter about, is it making me who I want to be? I don't know that anyone can answer that question truthfully and say, yes, the anger that's been built up inside of me for all this time, it's making me more of what I want to be. It's making me a better example for my family. It's making me more like Christ. Is that likely? Is that possible? What are you angry about this morning? This morning, the encouragement then is to take your anger to God, not to be angry with God, but to take your anger to Him, and maybe to remind yourself and to remind myself as well that God has every right in the world to be angry with you, and He has every right in the world to be angry with me, His rebellious child who has failed Him time and time again. Is He angry with you? Is He angry with me? Is He holding on to it? This morning, if you need to respond to God's invitation, this is your opportunity. If this morning is your first time to become a child of His through His plan that He's laid out for salvation, we'd love to help you with that. This morning, if you have another need from the church and there's something that we can do, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.